Hola y bienvenidos a Keep It Fictional, un podcast de libros de la Biblioteca de Port Moody. Yo soy Emma y aquí conmigo son mis amigas Corinne, Sadie, y Virginia. So it is now October, which means that it is Latin American Heritage Month here in Canada, as well as Hispanic Heritage Month in the United States. Latin American Heritage Month is a time to celebrate the achievements and contributions the Latina community has made across Canada. The Latina community is vast and culturally rich, meaning making it quite difficult to encompass the diversity of the Latina diaspora in one definition and with one cultural identifier. Latina Canadians come from all different countries across North America, Central America, South America, and the Caribbean, and they all bring with them distinct cultures of their countries of origin, including many different Indigenous cultures and traditions. If you're interested in learning more, I recommend that you check out the Vancouver Latin American Cultural Center over in East Van. They offer many different programs to educate on and to celebrate Latin American Heritage Month, and you can check those out on their website. So, to celebrate Latin American Heritage Month here at the Port Moody Library, we have many wonderful books to share with you all by Latina authors of different cultures and experiences. Some authors that live in these countries, some authors that are members of the diaspora and live here in Canada. So, as you well know, my book friends and I already read a lot of translated literature. And I know one book friend in particular reads a lot of books that were originally written in Spanish. I'm looking at Virginia here. So, our backlog already has lots of recommendations for you from Latina and from Spanish speaking authors. But I hope that you're able to find a new book or author to check out today. I also want to emphasize, like we've said before, that it's important to read Latina books by Latina authors not only during October, but all year round. We want to celebrate and uplift the voices of authors, creators, and artists across all different countries and cultures in Latin America and in the Latina diaspora. And we encourage you to do the same. So, with that, I think it's time to hear about some of the books that we have today. And today we're going to start with Virginia.
All right. So there are many reasons to pick a book. And the book I read for today, I pick up for a very, very silly reason because it promises me a story about a Pitbull impersonator. Yes, the singer, rapper Pitbull. I don't care about Pitbull. I don't know anything about him. I don't know his songs. I think he did the Man in Black song, which is kind of fun, I guess. A little catchy. All his songs kind of sound the same to me. He has this smirk on his face all the time. He does this dance. Apparently, he has this weird laugh that he does with his nonsense lyrics, and that's kind of all I know about Pitbull. But just something about a book about a Pitbull impersonator that I find extremely funny, and I just thought that I'll just pick this book up just because of that. Our Pitbull impersonator is Izzy, and he's been making pretty good money being Pitbull, walking around in Miami, making people pay to take pictures of him or like working at parties and stuff like that. But unfortunately, this very viable career path has to come to an end because he received a cease and desist letter from the Pitbull people. Now, Izzy really thinks that give only he could talk to Pitbull, if only he could talk to the man himself, then Pitbull would understand that having a taller, a buffer version of himself walking around Miami is definitely a good thing. Unfortunately, there's no talking to the man himself. So I guess Izzy would have to find a different job, which is kind of okay because, shaving your head every day is very annoying. But it's also maybe the universe telling Izzy that it is time for him to pursue the dream of every Cuban American to become the next Tony Montana, aka Scarface. Izzy knows Scarface is fictional, based on a real person, but fictional mostly. And Izzy also knows that Al Pacino is not even like Cuban American. In fact, there are only 2 Cuban Americans in the actual Scarface movie. However, the movie is so inspirational to so many people. Izzy has watched that movie so many times that he has boiled down Tony Montana's road to success to a simple 9-step plan. Step 1, find a Manolo, the sidekick. Step 2, get your grad suit dry cleaned. Step 3, get hired as a dishwasher. Step 4, get hooked up with shady dudes who hire us for a job of some sort. And then step 5, do job and excel. Step 6, quit the dishwasher job the minute you feel tried by the boss and walk out in a show. And then step 7, get paid by shady dudes and get hooked up with another bigger job. Step 8, do that job and excel at it. And step 9, meet future wife, aka Michelle Pfeiffer. Should hate you a little bit at first, but not really. And of course, on top of all that, just practice all the lines that Scarface says in the movie and starts inserting a few more F words into your daily conversation with everybody else. So that is his plan. Very simple, my friends. It's very easy to do. He's got it written down neatly in his notebook. So he needs to put his pitbull career behind and he's going to go find his Manolo. But of course, things are not always as easy. This is one way to describe the book Say Hello to My Little Friend by Jennine Capó Crucet, a darkly funny story about a young man trying to find himself and to establish himself in Miami, America. I find myself laughing, I find myself grinning and forgetting that I'm on a bus and I probably shouldn't be doing that. And because the universe just keeps messing with Izzy's plan. For example, his Michelle Pfeiffer showed up way too early in his story. And he's like, no, like, you're going to ruin this thing. Like, I need to follow exactly like what the movie does. So even though he knows that she is his Michelle Pfeiffer, even though they can sense this connection, he has to go ahead and ruin his definitely not a date so that everything can just, like follow the order that he has. There are also so many moments where he's wondering like, wait, am I Tony Montana? Or is this other guy Tony Montana? Am I Manolo? Like, what is this all about? It's got so many kind of like really smart, really funny commentaries on Scarface, the movie itself, like it being fairly controversial, stereotyping like the whole community. And, incidentally, I also know nothing about Scarface. I've never seen the movie. so, so, so I learned a lot both about Pitbull and Scarface from the book. And also sort of how media shapes, like how we see ourselves and how sometimes we see other people. But that's just one way to describe this book. Another way to tell the story in Say Hello to My Little Friend is that this is a story of a man and a whale, two beings trying to find one another and finding someone who understands. It's a story about a young boy named Izzy. When he was 7 years old, he was led to a beach by his mother. And after some exchange of words, some arguments with a handful of other people, he was told to get on a tiny little raft, a boat that is leaving Cuba and heading to America. He doesn't remember much from the trip. He woke up and then he was told that, he's now in the States. His mother didn't make it. She drowned on the way. And he's now going to live with an aunt that he has never met before. His mother's sister who knows very, very little about his nephew, who has no intention ever to have a child, but now fully embraces her role and gives this young boy the best care that he can get. 13 years later, the young boy is all grown up, now 20 years old. He wants to know more about his mother. So he starts asking questions. But he doesn't know what dangers he's getting himself into, because there are many people within the Cuban American community who do not want to see the past resurface. Some of them even on the same raft as this young boy. But he needs to know, Izzy needs to understand why his mother did what she did, to feel that hole in his heart, a hole that Lolita knows really well. Lolita is an orca whale
We met her in the first chapter of the book, where she was captured, where she was separated from her pod, separated from her mother. We watched several whales getting killed during this process, some trying to free Lolita from the net. Lolita is then sold to the Miami Seaquarium for just $1,000, where she spends her days being trained to perform day in and day out, being fed food that you will never find in the ocean, in a tank way, way, way too small for her, a tank in which she has to share in the beginning with Hugo, another whale, but not anymore, because one afternoon, Hugo bangs his head repeatedly against the wall to end all of it. And the other whales watch and did not stop him because they understand. Lolita is forgetting what the ocean feels like. Everything from before her life at the Seaquarium is getting blurry. She's starting to forget. But then one day she hears a voice that is filled with the same pain, the same anguish, the same sense of loss. And she knows she needs to reach out to this voice to tell them that she understands, to tell them that she feels what they feel. But where in Miami is this voice? But she's going to try to find it. Say Hello to My Little Friend is also this other story, a devastating and heartbreaking look at two beings violently torn away and dumped into a new place, who needs to have their stories, who need to have their past so they can help to find themselves, to help anchor themselves in this world so that they don't just give up. Two beings that have lost their ties to the roots, who are desperate to regain that connection so that they can know who they are. And that cruelty that these two are subjected to because of people, because of politics, because of the lack of care for the world. We can see the effects of climate change like kind of bubbling up to the surface of this story. And this book is full of just lines that like really, really hurt. Like there's one that when they're talking about Lolita, it said, well, ask the biologist, at what age is it safe to remove an orca from its mother? The biologist will shake her head and say, well, whatever age it would be okay for you to lose yours. It's a really it's a testimony to Jennine Capó Crucet's skills to juggle these two sides of the story. And I think you need both of them, the Scarface, the more funny, kind of darkly funny stuff, with this like other story of the orca whale, the story of a Cuban American migrants. And she does sit so well in switching those points of view and be able to juggle the two sort of very different emotions and really like put them together. And you don't just have like the point of view of Izzy and also with Lolita, but you also get other perspectives so they can fill in those missing information, and you get like a fuller picture of what the impact is for the actions present and past. And she also does some rearranging of the timeline. So again, like you get the story in a sort of out of order, but it's done so well, it's never really confusing. Jennine Capó Crucet is also really, really smart in her analysis, like by way of this novel, of what it means to be Cuban American. On the fronts, that's another reason why I picked this up, but there is a blurb from Charles Yu. And yes, nothing is going to be interior Chinatown, but it gives me that same vibe. Is that examination of a hyphenated identity. What does it mean to be Cuban American? And there's a whole chapter, in fact, on this book about, well, what does it mean to be a Cuban American novel? What does it mean to be a Cuban American movie? How can people tell? Like, is there a checklist? Like, like she was kind of wondering, like, is it like, having a wedding that's more like a club? Is it having palm trees, having neon lights, having all this Art Deco stuff? Is it having like old Cuban guys playing dominoes, smoking cigars? Like, do I qualify? Do I qualify as a Cuban American? Like, and is it Cuban American enough? And it's just like really interesting the way she kind of talk about it. It's very much like Charles Yu book, talking about like all these specific elements that are supposed to evoke a certain place or group of people. Like, what does it mean to have these things that are so much identified with a community, but it's also limiting how we think about that community? Pitbull also gets a chapter in the book. And
like he's fully aware of the caricature that is him. And, again, using his voice, talking about, again, what is he perpetuating in terms of his image, the stereotype, and the place itself, Miami, like how do people know that you're in Miami? And what does it, mean when you have all these things that people, oh yeah, that's Miami, and that you're trying to like match the impression, you're trying to match these expectations of what people have of you. There's a lot of really like in underneath that really funny kind of story, there's a lot of really thought-provoking questions that Crucet is observing and also making fun of at the same time. And I think she does it really, really well. So if you're looking for, I don't know, like a book that has, it's funny, but also like really moving and really sad at the same time, about an orca whale, about Pitbull, about Scarface, like I think this would be a really interesting read for this particular month and also for any time of the year. So that is Say Hello to My Little Friend by Jennine Capó Crucet.
Thank you so much, Virginia. I never expected a book about Pitbull or like a Pitbull impersonator would go so well with like a story of an orca whale, with a story with this kind of like really sad story of being separated from your family. So that sounds really fascinating. So I will share next. My book is by a Mexican author, so not an author from the diaspora, but someone who was born and raised in Mexico City. She's a novelist and an essayist named Brenda Lozano. And before I get into the actual book, I have to say once again on the record that people on Goodreads do not know what genres are. I had the same issue when I was looking at the Goodreads page for this book in particular. So this book is called Brujas in Spanish or Witches in English. And it's got like one of the coolest covers I think I've ever seen. It's got this like super sick bird woman with this beautiful kind of traditional Mexican outfit. Very cool cover. I was immediately sold on the book when I saw it. And I can only assume that this happened because of the title of the book, because of what the cover looks like. But people on Goodreads tagged the book's genres as fantasy, horror, paranormal, and magical realism, which there is absolutely none of in this entire book. So like I think it might just be a fantasy problem where people don't understand what fantasy means. Like there's hallucinogenic mushroom trips, which I guess some people might think is fantasy, but that happens in real life, so I don't understand what was going on. But I digress. I have beef with people on Goodreads. Um, so this book is not a fantasy. It's kind of like Virginia's. It's got these two parallel narratives that are woven together really expertly. It's a story about two very real women born in different centuries both within Mexico, and how their lives intersect following the murder of an indigenous trans woman. So one of the stories is that of Zoe, who is kind of a vaguely Gen X or millennial woman living in Mexico City, and she works as a journalist. And the other story is that of Feliciana, an indigenous curandera or a healer living in a rural mountain town called San Felipe. Feliciana heals people using a traditional ceremony called a velada, which involves feeding those being healed psychedelic mushrooms that she foraged in the mountains. And traditionally in her culture, women do not become curanderas, they do not become these healers. It was the practice of Feliciana's father and her grandfather and her great-grandfather, and it was the practice of Feliciana's cousin Paloma, who taught her the secret of the ceremonies when they were young. Paloma is Mushe, which is a traditional third gender in some indigenous cultures in Mexico. And when she started presenting herself as Mushe, as a trans woman, she stopped practicing the ceremonies, which were traditionally meant for men. So the book begins with Feliciana learning that Paloma was murdered. And Zoe, the journalist from Mexico City, was sent to San Felipe to meet Feliciana and to report on Paloma's murder. Feliciana does not speak Spanish, or what she calls the government's language. She speaks the language of her ancestors, and she cannot read or write. So she speaks to Zoe through an interpreter throughout the entire book. Throughout the entire book. The chapters alternate between the two women, between Zoe and Feliciana, sharing experiences from their childhood. They mostly speak about their mothers and their sisters and the relationships that they had with the women in their lives. Feliciana speaks about how her grandmother became sick when she was young and how Paloma, who was a boy then, healed her in a velada ceremony. And it was then that Paloma taught her that she, Feliciana, had the gift of the language, that she could practice the ceremonies as well. And in Zoe's chapters, she often speaks about her relationship with her sister Leandra and how Zoe, as the older sister, had to be the respectable and the responsible one for their parents. And Leandra was the rebel who started a fire at her school when she was 13. And how she started hooking up with boys and girls around the same time when she was a young teenager. So Leandra was the rebellious child, while Zoe had to be kind of practical and more responsible. Both of the women talk about their relationships with the men that raised them. Feliciana's with her grandfather, who was never accepting of Paloma and of her Mouche identity. And Zoe's father, who she was very, very close to, despite the fact that he was a little bit aloof, a little bit cold, but he died from a heart attack when Zoe was only a teenager. So she carries quite a bit of trauma from that. Feliciana also talks about how her village was affected by colonial forces at work within Mexico, how outsiders come to her village when they learn that what she can do, when they learn about her ceremonies, and demand her mushrooms and demand that she does ceremonies for them so that they can learn from them without truly respecting what those ceremonies are and what they mean to Feliciana and to her culture and to her community. She talks about how celebrities from America and from Argentina and from Britain come to her to be healed. She talks about how documentary filmmakers come to film her, and she became, after this film was made, she became a global phenomenon as a curandera and as the only woman to be one, since it's traditionally a man's career. Feliciana is actually based on a real Mazatec curandera, an indigenous curandera from Oaxaca, from southern Mexico, named Maria Sabina, who did veladas for people like John Lennon, Keith Richards, and Bob Dylan. And in the book, Feliciana actually does a ceremony for a character who's never quite named, but he could only be the musician Prince. In both the book and in real life, the curanderas attract the unwanted attention of wealthy white people who lack the respect for the sacred and traditional purposes of their ceremonies. And in the book, this causes Feliciana to make a lot of unwanted enemies within her village, especially from men who also are trying to practice as healers, but being a little bit more shady about it, men who are feel threatened by Feliciana and by what she can do. So while Zoe is in San Felipe to learn about Paloma and her murder, she ends up learning a lot more about herself through the connections that she makes with Feliciana and through the conversations that they have throughout the whole book. All of the women in this story, both Feliciana and her sister, Paloma, Zoe and her sister Leandra, they all must find their own way in a country that's kind of overrun with this machismo culture. Men appear throughout the story, but they're always in the peripheral as fathers or lovers or sometimes something a little bit more dangerous. But the book is very much about the women and the relationships and the healing and the power and the patriarchy that they learn about. So while I was reading Witches, I actually alternated between reading the book itself and listening to the audiobook. And I highly, highly recommend the audiobook version. Since the whole book is kind of just one long conversation between these two women while Zoe is there to interview Feliciana. Since they're like sitting together in the same room and verbally sharing their stories, it feels very much like oral storytelling. And Feliciana's chapters in particular are very kind of circular and repetitive. She makes a note that she can't read or write, so the way that she communicates and shares knowledge is entirely through oral storytelling. And when I was reading the actual book, I got a little bit lost because it would repeat itself pretty often. She would kind of talk in really long circles before making a point. So like I would get a little bit lost, but that rhythm works really, really well when it's spoken to you, when it's read to you. So I remember there being kind of a stark difference between what it felt like to read the actual book and to listen to Feliciana's chapters. So I really, really recommend listening to the audiobook. So if you like books that are about complex female relationships, stories about queer women, obviously Paloma is Mouche, and then Zoe's sister Leandra is bisexual. So there's a lot of interesting queerness happening in here. If you like stories about healing, if you're like me in Virginia and you like a nonlinear narrative, because this book doesn't have like plot, I would say. It's kind of just these two women sharing all these different experiences about their lives. So it jumps quite a bit to different time periods in their lives. Or if you like oral storytelling as a writing style and you're interested in checking out a really good audiobook, then I would highly recommend Brujas, or Witches is the translated title, by Brenda Lozano. All right, so that was my book for today, and I think it's time to jump into our existential question. So, as is kind of a tradition on these types of episodes during Pride Month or for Truth and Reconciliation Day, we tend to shout, or Asian American Heritage Month, we tend to shout out other authors, other books that we would recommend that kind of fit within these categories. So, for today's episode, I'd like to hear some other recommendations from my book friends about other Latina Canadian or Latin American authors that you guys want to shout out today.
Okay, so I think I've talked about a lot of them on the podcast before, but Laura Taylor Namey does kind of YA romance stuff, and I really loved hers. Isabel Cañas, Isabel Ibanez, Aidan Thomas, Cemetery Boys is one of my favorite novels, and Anna Marie McLemore as well.
A book that still kind of has stayed with me. I read it a couple of years, I think, on this theme, was Undocumented Americans by Carla Cornejo Villavicencio. And she has a new fiction book out that I was going to read for this topic, but ran out of the library too fast to check it out. And so that is a book that has really stayed with me for a really long time. And I think the fiction book is a light fictionalization of her life and some of the stories that she shares in this one. I'm going to shout out Sylvia Moreno Garcia because she is local to Vancouver. She has the new book out, Something Bales Salome. 7 Bales? 7 seems like a good number. It's at home right now that I'm going to give a shot. Always Erica L. Sanchez, who wrote Not Your Perfect Mexican Daughter, which I think is essential reading for everyone. On the romance front, I have recently really enjoyed Mia Sosa, who did The Wedding Crasher and The Worst Best Man. Great title. And also Gabby Rivera, who did a really great YA book that was also turned into a graphic novel, Juliet Takes a Breath, which I really, really enjoyed, about kind of like a writer's progress. So yeah, those are my picks.
Thank you, Corinne. I haven't read Juliet Takes a Breath yet, but that's one of Kate's favorite books. So that's one that's been on my radar for a while. Despite being the host and supposedly being prepared for this episode, I feel like I didn't think about this question. So I can only think of 2 off the top of my head. But the book Aristotle and Dante Discovered the Secrets of the Universe is one of my favorite YA novels about Mexican American teens living in El Paso. And I feel so bad I can never remember the author's entire name, but it's Benjamin Elvire Sáenz. I apologize for not being able to pronounce it. But that book is really wonderful and it makes me cry. And then the poet Ada Limon, who I spoke about for our poetry episode way back, is a really, really excellent writer and the current poet laureate of the United States, which is pretty exciting. And I guess I could shout out, there's a book that I'm looking forward to that I spoke about on our fall looking forward to episode. That is kind of a sequel to Che Guevara's Motorcycle Diaries called Latin American Diaries. So that's not one that I've read yet. But as a teenager, I got like super interested in learning about Che Guevara. So I'm looking forward to that one coming out.
For me, it would be shout out to Angie Cruz again. She wrote the book How to Not Drown in a Cup of Water, which was one of my favorite book, one of the years. I think the character Carla remains one of my favorite protagonists of all time. Just love her voice so much. And then Justin Torres, I think I talked about Blackouts on this show recently. I still haven't read his first novel, which is We the Animals, because I think that one's supposedly more straightforward, and me and straightforward. Just so I feel like I would just stick with the one that I really really like, and then but one day I'll get to that. And then I think because it's Halloween coming up, I want to shout out to a horror, Juan Martinez, who has a book called Extended Stay, super creepy. If you can deal with like body horror stuff, about a person from Colombia moving to Las Vegas, and trying to just make a living as a line cook at this hotel, and the hotel has other plans for him. So I love that a lot. And of course, I think one of the books that I think it reminded me, because I think we used it for one of our program recently, Maxi Kid, with Pedro Martin. Yeah. I know, like that is like one of my favorite comics, it's just so good. And again, like, I think it would be I think perfect for this particular episode specifically, sort of that experience. So yeah. I will skip all the other Latin American authors because we'll be here all day, so I'm just gonna not say them.
Yeah, I recently did Mexikid with the Kids Comic Club here at the library, and it was a huge hit. I think it was the first book that like every kid really, really connected with. So that one is so funny. For kids and adults, everyone should read Mexikid. Um, awesome. Thank you folks so much for sharing your recommended books. And I think we are on to Kareen. What book do you have to share for us today?
This is what we knew. On January 28th, 1948, a Douglas D-53 airplane took off with 32 people on board. This particular plane only had seats for 26. Frank Atkinson, the pilot, was a World War II veteran and who had flown in the Pacific and was actually flying with his wife that day, as all the other air stewards had called in sick and or hungover from the party the night before. On board as well with Frank and Bonnie was the INS guard Frank Chaffin. These are the only names that we knew. The 28 other passengers were all Mexican migrant workers being deported. At 10:30, workers in the fields outside of Coalinga looked up in the sky and saw a plane trailing smoke. The local people watched in horror as they saw the plane catch fire. One of the wings ripped off, and it plummeted to the ground. People and farmers rushed to the site to see if there were any survivors, but there were none. A bus driver taking children home from school that day stopped on the side of the road to help. One of the little girls remembers stepping off of the bus to see what was happening, and 70 years later is still shaken by what she saw. Frank, Bobby, and the guard were returned to their families and buried in proper graves. The rest of the 28 migrant workers were buried in a mass grave marked with only Mexican nationals. Their families were never contacted. Their names were never investigated. Some families only learned that they had lost loved ones through a grapevine of information traveling over the border. This story so incensed the poet and folk songwriter Woody Guthrie that in 1948 he wrote a poem called Deportees, lamenting and furious at the fact that these 28 people remained anonymous. Martin Hoffman eventually set this song to music, and it was popularized by Peter Seeger. Cesar Chavez eventually heard of this story and was so incensed as he was serving in the U.S. Navy that these people went so unknown that he was spurred to start his labor movement. In 2009, poet, performer, and writer Tim Zed Hernandez remembered the song. He didn't really know the story of it, and as he learned a little bit more, he became haunted by the unknown names. He is a third-generation American. His parents were migrant workers. His grandparents were migrant workers from Mexico. They had been his people. They had crossed the border to work in the fields, and he became obsessed with tracking down the names and the stories of those lives lost. And that he did, using Facebook and email and traveling and crisscrossing over the border and back. He tried to find and honor the memories of the people that had been lost and forgotten. He found sweethearts who were left behind, promises of marriage never fulfilled. He found best friends who still remembered the good times that they'd had. He remembered one of the players who was obsessed with baseball and joined a migrant worker baseball league that they had in California. He remembered the man who loved his dog. All of these people joined what was called the And again, I apologize for my pronunciation, Bracero program. So the history of the United States and Mexico in terms of migrant labor goes back a very, very long time. This particular agreement during 1942 to 1964 saw over 5 million workers travel from Mexico into the United States due to the war labor shortage. Many of these people came from small farming villages, and they had ancestors who remembered when California, the place that they were going to, was actually under their rule. California had only joined the Union in 1850, and the border had essentially been drawn in the sand. These people traveled through cattle cars, were inspected like cattle, and humiliated to be granted the privilege of working in the United States. Many traveled and returned for many years, and they had different reasons for going. Some of them needed money to start a family. Two went to work in order to find the money to buy a well for the village so that the farms could thrive. Some just needed it for their sick families. Sometimes their visas ran out. It was to be expected. They would be deported and returned. And especially after the end of World War II, when the soldiers started coming back and looking for work, people started to deport these workers in the efforts of appeasing politics. They were ostensibly given a choice. They could either go back in the really quite gross cattle cars or take this newfangled technology of the train. And this is the story of 28 people who may or may not have had the choice to take the plane or the train. Hernandez has devoted countless times and efforts to tracking down and orally recording these stories. He travels through California as well as to Mexico and records the stories of the people left behind and their memories of the survivors on his trusty little tape recorder. The entire narrative reads more like a memoir of the people than a particular history of what had happened. He is described in a New York Times review as a listener. And that's the sense that you get from it, that he sat and he listened to these stories and let the families speak and kind of brought the victims of this tragedy alive. He doesn't spend a lot of time editorializing, and I think that's what makes this story so impactful. What happened was a tragedy, but it's also largely indicative of the way that U.S. has, had, and will treat migrant workers, and the same in Canada. They're seen as disposable. However, they are integral to the agricultural running of the countries. What happened to them and the easy dismissal that the governments of both the United States and Mexico had to their safety and lives is exemplified by the fact that no one bothered to find their names. They simply put them all in a mass grave, dusted their hands, and were done with it. To the point where some families simply threw rumors as nothing was confirmed, either thought that their family members were dead when they were in fact alive, or thought that they were alive when they were eventually actually dead. Did I cry reading this book? Yeah, I really cried quite hard. Tim Hernandez, I think, is primarily a performer. And so he takes a lot of these stories and fictionalizes them, tells them in a way that is not necessarily historical record, but is done in an effort to make them seem more like people. And all of them seem so human, the ones that he was able to track down. Only 12 of them, of the 28, have ever been fully named and recognized. Through his efforts, fundraising, and working within the community, they were able to finally put a proper gravestone over where the victims were laid to rest. And he continues throughout this time to try and track down the rest of the names of the victims 70 years later. This book is And They Will Call You. And he wrote a follow-up book a couple of years later talking about the process of writing this book, talking about how this story really links to his own personal ancestry and history and the generational trauma of the difficulty of being a migrant farm worker, of being both in a society and outside of his society, never being able to really find a home, and the hardships and racism faced by the people working in the fields, who are, again, an integral part of the agricultural system, however, seen as disposable and almost inhuman. I think that this book is a really important part of the story, and he tells it with such sensitivity and in many ways a little distance. He's not there to editorialize. He's not there to make this a part of a bigger story, but you can't help as to do that yourself. And I think that is what is so wonderful and so clever about this. He shows you the victims. He doesn't tell you to care, but through his writing and through the memories of the people, you do care deeply about what happened to these people and the larger story of the plight of migrant workers. So if you are looking to kind of delve into what at the time was one of the most disastrous, the biggest air disaster in American history that has largely been forgotten, or perhaps you heard Joni Mitchell or Dolly Parton cover this song, Deportees, maybe you want to delve a little bit deeper, and I can absolutely recommend that you do so by reading And They Will Call You by Tim Z. Hernandez.
Thank you so much, Corinne. I always appreciate when you bring in a nonfiction story to topics like this, and especially one that I feel like not a lot of people would have familiarity with, but is really, really crucial, especially thinking about the history of Latin Americans in the United States and what they've been through. So thank you so much for bringing that to us. And last we have Sadie. I'm hoping for something a little bit more uplifting. Let's see what Sadie has for us today.
All right. Well, I went back to my roots with this one, and I found a good suspenseful, magic-infused, romantic YA fantasy. Definitely a fantasy, Emma. I will tell you 100%. Definitely fantasy. It is full of betrayals and twists and surprise endings and cliffhangers. So this is Incendiary by Zoraida Córdova. I believe that Cordova has been mentioned on the podcast a couple of times before. I know the vampire one. I think they were involved in that. And then there was one other that I can't think of right now, but I do remember because I checked the spreadsheet and to make sure this one was not mentioned. But I think that she has been. And she's an Ecuadorian American author, best known for her Brooklyn Brujas series, which I read was originally started as a Latinx version of Charmed, which honestly sounds wonderful to me. And I think that's kind of what the remake of Charmed, the TV show, was supposed to be as well. So I was actually planning on reading that one for the episode, but I was able to get my hands on the audiobook of Incendiary. And so I decided to try that instead. After reading this, I will probably go back to Brooklyn Brujas and see what it's like as well, because I like her writing. So Incendiary begins as a story of acceptance, or rather a lack of it. Renata Convida has always been an outsider, at least as long as she can remember. Growing up in the palace in Puerto Leones, she was always kept apart from the other children. To be entirely accurate, she was actually kept apart from most other people. The only people she was allowed to see were Justice Mendez, her mentor, and the people that Mendez would bring to her. The people she was supposed to, let's say, learn about. These people she never saw for long, just long enough to look into their minds, into their memories, and get a glimpse of their lives, a glimpse of their secrets. When she was done, the memory would disappear from their minds forever. It now belonged to Renata. And of course, to Mendez and the king of Puerto Leones. These people would then be taken away, and Renata would never see them again. At first, she wasn't really sure where they went, or at least she didn't think to wonder. However, as she got older, she began to realize that they were taken to the dungeons, or to the execution stand. And the older she got, and the more secrets she stole, sometimes Mendez instructed her to keep taking, to keep stealing their memories until they were no longer people, until they were just hollow bodies. In these cases, Renata didn't want to know where they were taken. She didn't want to think about them ever again. By the time she realized that she was being used to kill people, to betray people, to search out mothers and fathers and entire villages of people who were then massacred, it was too late. Her own mother and father were gone, burned along with the rest of her village, found because of the information that she had passed along to the king. By this time, she had no one left in the world except Mendez. Nowhere else to go. But that was almost 10 years ago now. Almost 10 years ago since the night her life changed forever. The night the rebel spies, the Whispers, set the city on fire in an attempt to overthrow the king. While that part of their plan failed, one thing they were able to do was rescue those in the palace, mainly children, who had been kidnapped from their families and forced to use their magic against their own people. Children like Renata. Almost 10 years ago, Ren was taken, rescued from the palace, and brought to live and train with the rebels. It should have been the best thing to ever happen to her. She had been, even though she hadn't realized it at the time, a prisoner, a pawn for the king and Justice Mendez, forced to betray her family, her people, forced to take the lives of countless people. She was now finally with others like her, the Moria, magic wielders, the Persuari, who could use and twist a person's emotions and hidden desires, the Ventari, who could read a person's thoughts, and the Robari, who could steal a person's memories. These were the very people who Renata had unknowingly been betraying to the king, the people whose minds she had ripped apart. Being rescued should have been the best thing to ever happen to her. But it wasn't. Ren was still an outsider. As a Robari, one of the rarest types of Moria, she was not trusted by anyone. She could look into a person's mind and steal their memories just with the touch of her hand. And if she took too much, she could turn them into a mindless hollow. It didn't help that she spent years working for the king, even if she was a child and had no idea what was happening, and even if most of the memories that she had of her time in the palace were hidden away somewhere in her mind in a place where even she had no idea how to access them. And so while she may be part of the rebel cause, she does not belong there. And many of her fellow Whispers ensure that she knows it, with mistrust and cruelty. However, not among them is Des, son of the rebel leader Ilan and head of her scouting team. Des has always believed in her, trained with her, given her a place on his team and in the Whispers, even loved her. Ren doesn't know what she would do without him, and he assures her she'll never have to know. Des is a Persuari and has powerful magic of his own and is very adept at using it to protect himself. However, there are Whispers amongst the Moria, Whispers in the kingdom of a weapon, something that can be used against the Moria and their magic. The king has been trying to eliminate them for decades, and it looks like he may have finally figured out how. To make matters worse, Des has caught the attention of the cruel and ruthless Prince of Puerto Leones, Castian. And one night, while Des, Ren, and the rest of their unit are returning from a retrieval mission, they are surrounded by the prince's guards. To save the rest of their unit, Des surrenders himself. The Whispers are given a warning. The entire rebel cause must surrender in 3 days, or Des will be executed. Ren is heartbroken, but determined to save him. However, when she learns from Ilan that they have no intention of rescuing Des, she's shocked. Even more so when Ilan tells her that the plan was always for Des to get captured, because then he can investigate this new weapon from inside the palace. All he has to do is use the code he has memorized to break out of the prison. The code, which was in his memories. Memories which Ren inadvertently stole the night before Dez's capture. I know. Yeah. Ren knows that if she doesn't get to Dez, doesn't somehow get him the code, which is now in her mind and not in his, then he will be killed. So building a weak truce with the other members of her unit, most of which have hated her until now, they travel to Puerto Leones to get Dez out of prison. When they arrive, they see that Prince Castian never expected them to surrender, was never going to give them 3 days, and is planning on executing Dez that very morning. Ren and the others try to get to the platform, try to save him. But as Ren sees Castian's sword slice through Dez's neck, she knows that all is lost. In a haze of grief and fury, Renata makes a choice, one that may doom her forever. She continues Dez's task. She searches out the weapon inside the castle. She goes back to the place where all her horrors began, to be turned into a tool for the king once again. All the while searching for the weapon, searching so that she can destroy it. And once she's found it, once she's destroyed it and has given the Moria a bit of breathing room, then she will find Prince Castian and kill him, but not before she makes him suffer in ways that he didn't know were possible. Da, da, da. As I said at the beginning, this book is suspenseful. It is filled with magic and betrayals, twists and reveals. Of course, there's romance. Renata is strong and smart and determined. She's the kind of protagonist that you root for kind of the whole book, even when she's forced to make some pretty terrible choices. She's driven by revenge, but definitely goes on a journey through the book, and her motivations kind of shift and her focuses change as she learns more about what is actually going on. I feel like the book does kind of follow a typical YA fantasy arc. There's a big focus on fighting the powers who are trying to control everyone. So I wouldn't say it has a lot of huge surprises in that sense. There are a few big reveals that may come as a surprise, although I'm proud to say I guessed them all. And it has, I've learned that you just guess the most ludicrous out there thing, and it's usually right. And it has a bit of a lull in the middle of the book where the focus turns to court politics, which is not my favorite. But I think that it was exactly what I was looking for. I think it kind of checked all of those boxes, just kind of brought me back to what I love about YA fantasy, the action, the adventure, the suspense, and all of that. I'll definitely be reading the sequel of this one, and I'll probably be checking out the Brooklyn Brujas series as well to see what else Cordova has to offer. But I would say that if you are looking for a high action, magic infused, Spanish Inquisition inspired, which is, I think if you know a bit about that, it's probably pretty obvious, but story with a strong female protagonist and an enemies to lovers romance, then Incendiary by Zoraida Córdova might be for you.
Awesome. I love that book. Had all the Sadie beats in it. I think maybe except for Assassins, but it had like magic, backstabbings, a nice romantic plot. It was, to me, it sounded like a very classic Sadie book. So I can always trust you to bring a lovely YA fantasy to the group. Thank you folks so much for sharing all of these wonderful picks today. I appreciate all of the different kind of cultures and experiences that were represented in the books. We had some fiction, we had some nonfiction, we had some fiction inspired by real people and real stories. And I hope our listeners were able to gain a new book or two or a new author or two to check out to celebrate Latin American Heritage Month. I want to say just one more time that we encourage you to read books by Latina authors all year round, whether those authors are from Latin America or from Canada, and especially check out Indigenous and queer authors. Hopefully, after listening today, you're inspired to seek out a book by a Latina or Latina Canadian author of your own. And with that, we say adios y hasta la próxima semana.